Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is June 24th, 2024, and we are here today in part 9 of what I think is a really important series on this book, Second Class Saints, Black Mormons, and the Struggle for Racial Equality by Dr. Matthew Harris. Today, we are going to be discussing a groundbreaking, institute-changing civil rights investigation that happened at Brigham Young University in the late 1960s that frankly led to BYU being willing to have Black athletes. So if you've ever wondered, when did BYU start? Did BYU ever have a ban on Black athletes? When was that lifted? And then what led to BYU having Black athletes? And what started pressuring BYU to have Black professors and to, be open to recruiting or not discouraging the attendance of Black students. Today is your episode. Really quickly, this is part of hopefully a 20-part series on the book. And we want to remind you all that this series is best enjoyed in sequence. There's 8 that we've already recorded before this. So we invite you all to go back and check it out. This series can be found on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and as its own YouTube playlist. And we also just want to remind you that Mormon Stories is putting up half the funds to pay Matt for his time, Dr. Harris for his time. And we're asking you, those of you who aren't already donors to Mormon Stories and the Open Stories Foundation, who value this content, to become donors for this specific project. 100% of your donations, if you donate through the link, will go to Matt. And you can cancel your donations when the series is over if you want. But all you got to do is go to donorbox.org/Matt Harris and donate. And if there's just a donor of means that could just kind of go in and make a large donation, or a few of you that can, that'll take away our need to continue asking. We've raised about a fifth of what we need to pay Matt what he deserves. So far, thank you for those of you who have stepped up. We know that tens of thousands of you are enjoying these episodes, and about 50 of you have donated to the series. So if you're really loving this series, please become a donor, a one-time or a monthly donor for the series, and we'll get Matt paid. Again, it's donorbox.org/Matt Harris. And so we're on chapter 5. We're going to be covering chapter 5 of this amazing book in 2 parts. And the official title of chapter 5 is Investigations and Protests. And we're also going to be talking about all the universities that stepped up to protest BYU and what that was like for BYU and for the leaders. Anyway, without any further ado, we have Gerardo joining us again because he does such a great job. We are putting together a panel of Black Mormons and Black ex-Mormons to react to this series. So please know that's in the works. And without any further ado, Matt Harris, welcome back to Mormon Stories. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, John and Gerardo. Nice to be with you guys again.
Yeah. So where I think today we want to focus on, the chapter bounces a little bit between sort of Hugh B. Brown and his attempts to get the priesthood and temple ban lifted in the 60s, and others who tried, like Sterling McMurrin. And then it talks a lot about these BYU protests and the civil rights investigation. Before we jump in, I'm going to just ask you a generic question. I had to leave early at the end of episode 8, where we were talking about George Romney and was it Stuart Udall, and sort of this national discussion about the priesthood ban in the late 60s. And, this question of if 2 national political figures are openly discussing a problem within Mormon doctrine and theology or policy, and it's clearly embarrassing for everyone, and the church is getting called out in major news publications, you would think that if there were ever a time for change to happen back then, it would have been in the late 60s. And, without giving spoiler alerts, of course, it's not another 10 years until after all this, 10, 15, 20 years, depending on how you're counting, 30, 40 years if we start in the late 40s, which is when a lot of this controversy emerges. You would think, though, that with all the heat going on with Bobby Kennedy killed in 68, with Malcolm X killed, with Martin Luther King killed in 63, and just it's JFK in 63, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X in 68. Is that right?
Malcolm X is a couple of years before that. He's 65.
Oh, 65. Okay. Well, with all the controversies in the United States in the late 60s, you think that if any point the church might change, it would be then, and it didn't. That left me wanting to ask you the question: what does your study of this particular issue teach us or tell us about what does and doesn't lead to change within the church? At least up until 68. Is there anything you do or don't want to share about that? Because I think that is an important question that a lot of people like to think about. And, it may be something you do or don't like to talk about.
Well, I mean, in the introduction to my book, I talk about that the brethren are not immune to larger societal trends, and certainly the civil rights movement. I could enumerate many ways in which the civil rights movement affects them, both personally and also with respect to the larger church. And for one example would be that they recognize they can't be so open about their church teachings, like, telling a Black person they're cursed, they're less valiant. They recognize that is really, really unpopular to talk about publicly. So they start to dial it down in the 1960s. But they don't want to give the impression that the civil rights movement is forcing them to make a change. That's just something that they don't want to do. And an interesting counterfactual for your question, John, would have been, what if George Romney, who was very loyal to the Brethren and to the church, unlike Stuart Udall, what if he joined Udall and produced a statement like Udall, suggesting that the ban was wrong, it needed to be changed? What would have happened if the church's two highest political personalities would have both worked in unison to accomplish that end? Turns out that Romney didn't and Udall did, but what would have happened if they both did it? That would have been really, really interesting. I don't know that it would have led to a change, but it certainly would have maybe expedited things a bit. I look back as a scholar, and when most mainline Protestant and Catholic churches are reinterpreting their theology to promote racial equality in the 1960s, I look back and I think it's impossible for the church to maintain this ban, maintain their opposition to civil rights. It's just not defensible, because what happens is that, and what does happen is that everywhere they go, they're being hounded by their views on race, whether it's civil rights, whether it's the ban. And the Brethren, you read their diaries, their journals, their meeting minutes, they're really frustrated by that, because that's the last thing they want to talk about, but yet that's what they're being forced to talk about. It plants seeds, John. There's no question it plants seeds. Sometimes these seeds take time to germinate and to come to fruition. But when people like Udall and, let's say, Romney, definitely planting seeds and forcing them to at least talk about the wisdom of lifting the ban. But it turns out, as we'll talk about in future episodes, that it takes a long time for Spencer Kimmel to lift the ban, because he has to get the rest of the Brethren to come on board, and that's no easy task.
Yeah. And for me, there's always the balance. There's planting seeds, which clearly it has to, especially when you see how much tension and stress, the Brethren were experiencing and sharing behind the scenes. But there's also just the idea that continues to reappear in your book, that activists agitating, lead the Brethren to think, well, now we can't make a change because it can't appear as though we're responding to activism or public pressure, because we can't have people believing that activists lead to change in the church. It's got to be people believing that God speaks to us through revelation, because we're prophets. Like that's that's the tension that I continually see, is a resistance to respond because you don't want people to see behind the curtain and stop believing that God is leading everything at the end of the day.
Well, I think it just comes to, we have to be reminded what revelation is, right? Revelation is a process, not an event necessarily. It doesn't mean that God can't speak to a church leader and say, hey, look, this is something that maybe needs to change in the church. I mean, I'm not discounting that. I'm just simply saying that when it comes to institutional changes, policy, doctrine, it's a process. You have to get the 12 to agree to it. You have to discuss it, debate it. And just let me give you a quick, interesting sidebar on this. That in 1960, when Sterling McMurrin gave his very high-profile, contentious speech to the NAACP, that's the speech where the church sent 2 representatives to monitor him, and he called it a doctrine. And afterwards, his good friend Lowell Benyon wrote McMurrin a letter, and he said, I wish you wouldn't have called it a doctrine. And McMurrin writes him back and says, well, it is a doctrine. Benyon writes him back and says, yes, that's beside the point. It's easier to change or get the brethren to change their minds if we call it a policy. And that exchange of letters between these 2 high-profile Latter-day Saints was really illustrating to me, because they're talking about strategy. If we call it a policy, they're more likely to change it. So obviously Benyon was following the Hugh Brown, David O. McKay tact, and McMurrin was calling it a doctrine, which indeed it was. So there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes about how do we get the brethren to change it. And to your point, John, about people ganging up or talking, pestering the brethren, and they kind of resist. I think the important thing is there's power in numbers. If there's a number of people agitating for a change, doesn't mean they'll get it, but they'll start talking about it. If it's just 1 or 2 people in isolation agitating for a change, it's harder to do because you can easily dismiss 1 or 2 loud voices. But if you get a whole bunch of people, it's hard to dismiss that. So I guess that's how I would answer that. If you want to get the brethren to talk about something that could potentially lead to a revelation, there has to be a critical mass of Latter-day Saints.
Okay. But also, as we'll see today, personalities matter. And we have the hardliners that we're going to be talking about. And it just sounds like until the hardliners either changed their minds or literally died, it almost doesn't matter what machinations happen. Even if you've got a, quote, mole in the first presidency, that can't override, super powerful senior apostles, right?
Well, I mean, I know that a lot of Latter-day Saints have a view of the brethren, but I think that it's not remiss to, they're people. They have personalities, they have preferences, they're strong-willed about some things and less so about others. And it depends on what the situation is, but it's possible that one apostle's really, really defending something, and then, 2 days later, he's exhausted his capital and he's not defending something else that maybe needs to be defended. So there's a lot of personality things going on here. And sometimes there are times where David O. McKay is a great example, where he would make a ruling that would be contrary to the 12. And sometimes it would lead to a lot of tension because the 12 thought that they should have had buy-in and more support. And let me give you one example. So Hugh B. Brown, we've talked about him. He's a crusader for racial equality. He had some baggage coming into church leadership because of allegations that he had taken bribes from a liquor commission, which I might add is not true. He was cleared of all that. But so we came into the leadership with baggage, and he had been proposed for the quorum of the 12 apostles on at least 6 or 7 different times before he was ultimately selected in 1958. And a lot of hardliners did not want him in the 12. And they were angry with David O. McKay when McKay showed up to a meeting once and said, hey, we're going to call Hugh B. Brown into the 12. And Joseph Fielding Smith and some others didn't like that. They thought that they should have been consulted and given their agreement, but David O. did it without their support.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, Matt. Well, let's jump in. And I think maybe the first place we can begin is with an introduction to Ernest Wilkinson. And then we'll talk about the civil rights context, and then we'll talk about BYU. Is that okay? Do you want to introduce us to Ernie?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ernest Wilkinson is one of Mormonism's most annoying characters. But I have a little affection for him in this story, and maybe that'll come out. But he's got a reputation from BYU faculty and students. He has a reputation as being a stern authoritarian, and the faculty called him two interesting names that sort of says it all. They called him Little Napoleon and Little Caesar. And both of those, the little part referred to his height. He was a short man, maybe 5'6", 5'7", and he was kind of rotund. He packed a pretty compact punch, if you will. And in those days, walking around the BYU campus, I mean, the stuff he would say and do to students would be just absolutely unheard of today. The guy would be sued for sexual harassment. I've talked to at least two students who were there in the 60s. They're now obviously in their probably 70s. But two of these students, Ernest Wilkinson, patted on the bottom, touching them inappropriately. That's what he did. He was just that way. And he was just a quick story about his stature. They were at a wedding once, and there was a line at the wedding, and Wilkinson was coming through. And there was a general authority daughter who was in the wedding line, and she was there shaking hands too. I can't even remember which general authority it was. But anyway, the daughter was there shaking hands. Ernest Wilkinson goes up to her and shakes her hand so hard, she actually flinches and sort of recoils. It was so hard. And finally, when he let go, she had her high heels on, so she's looking down at him. And she said, "If you ever do that to me again, I will kick you in the nuts." And now, I don't know what that means. Does that mean she did that because of who her father was? I don't know. But anyway, that's what he did. And he was very difficult to work with. He was we would say today, he was a red personality. John, you're a psychologist. You might refer to these color-coded schemes. He was a red personality. And what was interesting about that is, as a red personality, he clashed with the other red personalities in church leadership, including Harold B. Lee. And so two very headstrong men who would often clash over policies at BYU. Ernest Wilkinson's a lawyer by profession. He went to George Washington University, where he received his Bachelor of Laws degree. Today we call it a JD, or Juris Doctorate. And he went on to Harvard for a doctorate of juridical science, which is the highest degree that one can get in the law. It's called an SJD, I think. Doctorate of Juridical Science. He had a law firm in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, where he made millions of dollars representing Native Americans on tribal land disputes. And so that's where he carved his focus. And by 1951, when there was an opening in the BYU presidency, J. Reuben Clark of the governing first president, I said BYU presidency is what I meant to say, I think. But in 1951, when there's an opening at BYU, J. Reuben Clark of the governing first presidency went to Wilkinson. They said, "Well, I'm going to recruit you." And Ezra Taft Benson, who was a stake president in the 1940s in D.C., so just before Benson was called in to be a general authority, Ezra Taft Benson knew Ernest Wilkinson well. Wilkinson was in Benson's stake presidency, as I recall. And so they developed a close relationship. And so Benson and Clark went to bat to get Ernest Wilkinson to be the next president. And what's interesting is there were at least 3 other LDS candidates with PhDs who should have gotten the position in terms of experience and credentials, but instead they took a chance on a lawyer. And without going into a lot of details, Wilkinson had this vision that BYU ought to grow. It ought to recruit students from beyond the Intermountain West. And that finally, it ought to offer graduate programs where its faculty could produce cutting-edge research. And so he does have this great vision. And over the course of his 20 years of leadership, the size of the institution essentially doubles. And anyone who walks on this beautiful Provo campus today will see that it bears Wilkinson's fingerprint just about everywhere you go.
And of course, there's the Wilkinson Center that we all, would visit as students there in his name and his honor, and many fond memories there. Okay, so that's Wilkinson. Now let's talk about the mid 60s and the environment. I guess LBJ, 1964, and why it takes 4 years for people to really care about what happens in 64.
One second, John. Before we go there, can we have Matt just talk a little bit about the controversial policies or things that Wilkinson did as president? I think you have like a little bit summary on the book about it. For example, the Vietnam War stuff and
yeah.
Just a flavor of his personality.
The spy ring happens under him, right?
Yeah.
The which does, John?
The spy ring?
Yes.
Yeah.
So Wilkinson imposed his particular conservative ideology on the institution. He wasn't rogue, of course. His views align with probably most of the leaderships in Salt Lake, excluding, people like Hugh Brown. But he was intensely conservative, and he was against student activism in the Vietnam War. This is an era in which a lot of students are finding their own voices. They're wearing, armbands opposing the war. They're putting pictures outside of their dorm windows across the United States at their respective universities. And Wilkinson didn't want any student activism at BYU. And so he forbade BYU students from putting anything that was anti-Vietnam in their dorm windows. He did not want any left-wing speakers to come to campus, which annoyed the heck out of liberal faculty because they were tired of hearing all these right-wing visitors coming and giving the devotional addresses or the forms. Actually, there'd be more forms rather than devotional addresses. So they didn't like that. And Wilkinson also imposes an honor code. And any of your listeners who have been to BYU, including myself, we're all well aware of what the honor code is, that you couldn't drink alcohol. It's against the word of wisdom. And so there was an honor code issue there. You couldn't have premarital sex, which of course would be against the church's theology that intimacy ought to be reserved for marriage. And then finally, and most critically for this discussion, that Black and white students could not date or marry. And they were to be called in if any Black or white couple on campus were seen to become, seen as too cozy. And
that was
this time, what's that?
That was written as part of the honor code. The interracial.
Well, so this is where it gets tricky. Where it gets tricky is Wilkinson's really clever, unlike some other fundamentalist Christian groups that run afoul of the government. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But Wilkinson did not put some of the most racist policies in the BYU literature. What he would do is there would be the BYU catalog. We welcome all people, all races, all ethnicities. And he was really, really smart not to put except Negroes, because he knew that would get him in trouble with the federal government. So he left that out. But in private, they devised a letter, that if a Black student were to apply to BYU or a biracial student, they were to receive a letter that he and his administration had written. And the letter simply said that, we can't really turn you away, but if you come here, you should know that you will not be happy. You can't date any white girls. There aren't any Negroes at the university. Truth is, there are 3 in the mid-60s. And there are not any Negroes in Provo. You'll be at a fish out of water. We feel you'll be bitter. That's the word they use. We feel you'll be bitter. So there's kind of like the real stated policies, and then there's this other letter that gets sent out. And he does that because he doesn't want anybody from the federal government looking over their shoulders saying, hey, look, you're doing something that's racist and against federal law. Well, and of course.
You've read that letter, right? You've seen it.
I have it.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it's not something the public can see. Is that right?
No, and it's in a restricted collection. And just so your listeners know, you guys, I want to be very clear. So when I work in restricted collections, I don't share material because I have to apply. People trust me, and I honor that to the day is long. I don't share restricted materials. Other time, this is with fellow scholars, this is with podcasters, this is with anybody. And that's why I get access to restricted collections, because I don't share. But if it's not a restricted collection and a scholar says, hey, I just read on page 34, you have this letter. I'm just curious. Do you have a copy you could send me? And if it's not restricted, I'm happy to do that. And I frequently do that. But with restricted material, I can't do that.
Okay. So there, just to be clear though, there was a form, it sounds like a form letter. If a black student applied to BYU in the 60s, there was a form letter sent out basically saying, you won't be happy here. You probably shouldn't come. Right.
That is correct.
Wow. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's at 1961. They wrote the letter. And I should say that what they're worried about, and I don't want to jump around too much, but they're worried about, of course, having black students come to BYU, and they're worried about the interracial dating and marriage we've been talking about. And in 1961, Utah State, so just, 100 plus miles to the north of BYU, they start to recruit black athletes, student athletes, and these black athletes create quite a scandal because they start to date these white Mormon girls. And this predominantly Mormon community of Logan, Utah, they're up in arms that these black kids, many of whom are from outside of Utah, they're coming to participate in sports, and they're dating white girls. And it becomes a scandal. The newspapers pick up on it. LDS parents in the area are protesting the university administration. And I remember going through David O. McKay's diaries in the first presidency minutes from this era, and it struck me that they're frequently talking about the scandal in Logan. And they're drawing the appropriate conclusions, which is that if they recruit black student athletes to BYU, they're going to experience the same fate, and they want to avoid that.
I was struck in your book by the father that writes, is it Wilkinson, basically saying, I'm concerned. I hear there's a colored student on BYU campus, and what Wilkinson's response is to that father. That was a fascinating exchange. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah. So this businessman, LDS man from Florida, this is 1952. He writes President Wilkinson. He had heard that BYU had a colored student, that's his word, and he was concerned that his daughter would go to BYU and could potentially date a black man. And I'm kind of chuckling, when I read this, because there's one, I think at the time in 52, there was one black person. I mean, what are the odds that his daughter would marry or date this man? But anyway, Wilkinson wrote back and he said, hey, you have nothing to worry about. We only have one colored student here, and we're going to keep the numbers really low for the reasons that you suggest. So he's trying to assuage the man that, if you send your daughter here, you'll be okay. What they're really worried about is the biracial student, because Ernest Wilkinson and his deputy, a guy named William Barrett, they talk about this a lot in private, and they talk about it with the board too, the board of trustees comprised of apostles. And they say that, we can't be sure who bears the curse if somebody light-skinned comes to BYU. And so anytime a stake president would write Ernest Wilkinson and they would say something like, I have this young man, part Negro, that's the word they use. We say biracial today, but I have this part Negro man or student who wants to come to BYU. What should I tell him? And sometimes these students, these biracial students, were not even LDS. They just wanted to come to BYU because the tuition was cheap and they had a friend who was going, usually a white friend. So the church leaders would ask Wilkinson and, the biracial, what do I do? Wilkinson in turn then asked the board, hey, I'm getting all these inquiries about part Negroes coming to BYU. What do I tell them? And they're caught in this really interesting dilemma because on the one hand, you can't say, well, we oppose black students or biracial students. They know that will get them in trouble. And so the counsel's always the same. We can't turn them away, but let's try to discourage them. That way we can have plausible deniability if the federal authorities go after us. We can say, we don't have any policies that keep them out. But of course, they would never tell him about this nasty letter that they're sending him saying you won't be welcome here because there aren't any Negroes in the community.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book that Joseph Fielding Smith was more concerned about a student that was a quarter black than he was a full black student, right? That light-skinned black people, Joseph Fielding Smith considered to be, quote, the most dangerous kind.
Yes. Remember the one drop rule. So the one drop rule, 100 ancestors, and one of those 100 has African ancestry, you're considered cursed. And so their fear is that you can't detect anybody who's light-skinned or biracial, and if that biracial student meets and marries a white student, then they're going to curse their offspring. That's what they're worried about. But with a black person, somebody with dark skin, you could avoid that because they have dark skin, and you can just make that assumption that they have African ancestry.
And tell the story about Harold B. Lee finding out that a black student, BYU student, was running for student government, and what Harold B. Lee says to Wilkinson.
That's a great one. So in 1960, Ernest Wilkinson was in a board meeting, and he told the brother, and he said, "Hey, we've got this colored boy who's running for the vice presidency." And Harold Lee went ballistic, and he said to Wilkinson, now these are two red personalities, two very headstrong men. Lee snapped at Wilkinson. He said, "My granddaughter's going to BYU, and if she goes there and marries a colored boy or dates a colored boy, I will hold you personally responsible," he tells him. And Wilkinson, being the fireball that he was, didn't miss a beat. He said, "You should hold yourself responsible because you made the policy." The policy meaning that black students can go to BYU,
right?
If they can be admitted.
Yeah. And I think it's important, Matt, for you to explain, especially to our Never Mormons, but I think even to our Mormon audience, what the BYU board, who the BYU board consists of, because it's not just like mid-level educators who are Mormon, right?
Yeah.
It's basically the Quorum of the 12 in the first presidency. Am I wrong?
Mostly. It's most of the apostles in the first presidency, not all of the apostles. And it's also a couple of lower-ranking general authorities. For example, Marion Hanks, who was a first quorum of the 70s. So this is a general authority tier of leadership ranking just below the Quorum of the 12. And Marion Hanks was on the Board of Education in the 1960s. And I don't know when women were invited. I think the 70s. Don't quote me on that. But today, of course, if you were to look at the Board of Trustees, there are women on there, usually from the leadership of the church, whether it's the General Relief Society presidency or primary. But in those days, it was mostly men, I recall, and mostly apostles, a couple of lower ranking general authorities. As far as I know, nobody outside of the church leadership was on the board. You would think that you may have an educator or something like that, but that wasn't the case.
And you do a really good job on page 130 of the book, sort of trying to provide the context for why, the LDS Church First Presidency, Quorum of the 12, would be so uncomfortable with black people, frankly. You talk about their background, what types of environments they grew up in, and how that would influence their discomfort.
Yeah. I mean, the United States is just full of racism, and a lot of that just goes right to the core idea of interracial relationships. Just take Hawaii, for example. 1959, when Hawaii was petitioning for statehood, people wanted Hawaii to come in long before 1959, but why 59? Well, there were so many people that opposed Hawaii because it was so interracial. They didn't support interracial relationships. And so a lot of conservative lawmakers in Washington, D.C. had opposed Hawaii coming to the Union for such a long time. And interracial opposition was at the heart of it. And with the Brethren, most of them grow up in Utah, Idaho, and in Arizona, these areas that don't have a black population. My sister lives in Huntsville, Utah, probably about 1.5 miles away from where President McKay used to live. And President McKay's son, David Lawrence, he said, "My father never saw a Negro growing up. Where he lived in Huntsville, there weren't any Negroes around." So he's very open about that. Spencer Kimball grew up in Thatcher, Arizona. It was the same thing. And Bruce McConkie and Mark Peterson, Gordon Hinckley, and others who lived in comparatively cosmopolitan Salt Lake City grew up in the 1920s and 30s. I mean, I think it was less than 1% of Salt Lake City in the 20s and 30s were African American. So they didn't grow up around black people. They didn't know them as friends. They certainly didn't see them at church. And the media at the time, of course, they would have gathered some of their views about black people from the media, but this is an all-white media for the most part. And so heaven knows, the white media portraying Black people in the mid 20th century wasn't flattering. And then you take, the church's teachings on race, that Black people are cursed and all of that. I mean, it doesn't bode well in terms of a favorable impression of an entire group of people that the scriptures have called them to proselytize. And so they're really uncomfortable around Black people. And they think nothing, at least some of them, I don't want to lump all of them together, but some of them, including J. Reuben Clark, would frequently use the N-word in his diary. And there's a great story of Spencer Kimball that really, really struck me, that was really powerful to me when I was reading his diaries. I'm going to read this to you. He was talking about in 1965, Spencer Kimball, who was then an apostle, he was visiting New York City on a church assignment, and his wife Camilla had gone with him. And Camilla had been begging him for a long time, Spencer, take me to a Broadway. I want to see a Broadway. And I don't think that was his cup of tea, but he agreed to do it. And I'm saying that lightly. I know that wasn't his cup of tea. After a long day of church meetings, right? The last thing you want to do is maybe go to a Broadway and be around more people. He was kind of an introvert. So one imagines he just wants to go back to his hotel and relax. But so being the good husband that he was, he takes his wife to this Broadway play. And as the play begins, he looks around, and I want to read to you what he wrote in his diary later that night. He said, the show itself was very good and entertaining, but the people that surrounded us made us wonder if we were in America. The colored people and the foreign element, the Puerto Ricans, it was almost unbelievable. And that really, really shook me, because this is a guy who grew up, spent the first part of his life in Arizona, then he moved to Salt Lake as a church authority. He's never been around racial diversity before, and he feels like a fish out of water.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that gives us really good context as to what is causing these BYU policies to be instituted and followed, right? To prevent Black people from coming to BYU. Where do you want to go next, John?
Yeah. So I was just going to quickly just read another little quick couple sentences. You mentioned that Wilkinson denied students permission to perform the Negro twist at BYU dances. As a Sam Cooke fan, that was particularly jarring to me, that literally BYU students couldn't do the twist. And also that, Joseph Fielding Smith, as we've mentioned in past episodes, called Black people darkies, that J. Reuben Clark used the N-word, so, and Thomas S. Monson also felt out of place. And you've told the story, I think, in a past episode as well, that when he found out that minority elements were moving into his, I guess, holiday neighborhood or Salt Lake neighborhood, that Marquis Peterson told him to move. And I'll just make the final point that many of the Mormon Stories interviewees that I interview in 2024 say that in the high schools they grew up in, there were few, if any, Black people in the modern era. So this is not necessarily just 40 or 50 or 60 years ago. This remains many parts of Utah and Idaho and even Arizona today.
It's true. I mean, even in the church today in 2024, less than 3% of the church body in the United States is African American. Yeah. So, a lot of Latter-day Saints, in their worship communities, are not around Black people. And certainly you get a higher concentration of Black saints in, say, Atlanta, Georgia, and, cities like that. But for the most part, throughout the church, there's just not a high concentration. So especially people in rural areas, they're not used to worshiping with people of color. I want to make an instructive point here that is important for today, maybe, and also important for the saints in the 20th century era that we're talking about. And that is that when Wilkinson is going to make a policy with the board's approval, I might add, that you can't perform the Negro twist at a BYU dance, the question then becomes, why? That's not scriptural. What does that have to do with the band? Because there's a theology that keeps the band in place. There's a theology that helps to understand why the church does what it does regarding people of African descent. But what does the Negro twist have to do with it? What difference does it make if white and brown kids are doing a popular dance that happens to be called the Negro twist? And there's nothing theological about that. There's nothing scriptural about that. And the answer is, of course, they're just so fearful of Black culture. And they're fearful of students imbibing in this culture that may ultimately affect their racial theology. And so that same fear is extended to Black faculty. They talk about 1960, Ernest Wilkinson had hired or had planned to hire a faculty member. And he read the person's resume. They had good credentials, good experience. Now, this is for a summer class, I might add. And at the 11th hour, Wilkinson, just before they tendered the offer, Wilkinson found out that this candidate was Black after he had approved him. And he said, we can't have our white students learning from a Black faculty member. We just can't. Again, this has nothing to do with the theology and everything to do with Wilkinson's prejudice.
Yeah. You have some a really interesting story, Matt, in the book about the brethren being worst fears becoming true when at the rival university, Utah State University, they started seeing that Black athletes openly boasted about dating white girls.
I think, Matt, did you mention that in today's episode already?
Yeah, just a few minutes ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's good.
And about how that causes the brethren to tighten up BYU admission policies. I think some of these admission policies you already covered. But there's the Barrett, basically the Barrett points, right, about how to do it. Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, that's actually a good segue. So just after the Utah State debacle in 1961, that's when Ernest Wilkinson and his top assistant, William Barrett, that's when they decide that they have to tighten up their admissions policies at BYU. And they create this interesting document that they want to use that will govern admissions. And Barrett asks an interesting question. He said, how can the door of the university be left open and still attract few Negroes? In other words, we can't say you can't come here and put it on our literature because we'll get into trouble by the federal authorities, but how do we discourage them? And so Barrett had this uncommonly frank 5-step plan. He said, first, do not proselytize Negro athletes. Don't talk to them. Don't try to convince them to come here. And if they do want to come here, just creating more hardship for us because we don't want them to come, but yet we can't tell them that. Number 2, discourage undue publicity of the Negro who is on campus.
What does that mean?
If there is a Black person visiting the campus, don't call attention to it. Just let them come on campus unnoticed, unmentioned, and don't bring any attention to it. Could open up a floodgate.
Yeah.
Number 3, watch moral standards carefully. Boy, there's a lot I could say about that. There's this irrational fear in the 20th century that you see this with Brown versus the board when they try to integrate schools post-Brown, that these young African-American men in particular, they can't control themselves. There are all these horrible, incredibly vile views about that these students will harass white girls. You see this a lot from Southern parents in the wake of Brown. They're really worried about sexuality, that somehow their students will be preyed on. It's just awful.
Wow.
So watch moral standards carefully. That's Barrett's way of saying that could happen here if we allow Black students. Number 4, quietly counsel students against dating a known Negro. Call in any boy or girl seen with a Negro. I mean, this is part of the underground here that Barrett's saying. If you see a white girl on campus or even off of campus dating a Negro or vice versa, they're to be called in and talked to. And number 5, send a prepared letter to answer inquiries of Negroes regarding admittance to BYU or church schools. So that's when a Black student shows interest, and then in response they get this really vile letters saying, you know, you can come here, but you won't be welcome, you won't be happy, and you'll be bitter.
Right. Wow.
And then there's a part on page 133 where they start getting questions about this policy. It's kind of in the first main paragraph at the top of 133. After Barrett establishes this policy, you've got athletic director Eddie Kimball talking to a reporter. Do you want to tell that story? Because it seems like they weren't fully comfortable being candid publicly about Barrett's private policies, correct?
Yeah, correct. And I want to give your listeners a bigger vision on this just for a quick moment. A lot of sports teams in the 60s were not integrated. And I'm a basketball person, come from a big basketball family. And one of the big basketball teams from the 60s would have been Don Haskins at the University of Texas, El Paso, started recruiting African-American athletes at a time when most people were not doing that. And so the country, because of the civil rights movement, they're talking about the propriety of having, you know, all white and all black teams. And so they start to integrate slowly by the 60s. Obviously, BYU has not caught up with this yet. And in 1962, the Arizona Gazette, a reporter asked the BYU athletic director, Eddie Kimball, why they don't recruit Negro athletes. And he says, quote, "We do not actively recruit Negro athletes and will not in the foreseeable future. This is not a matter of discrimination," Kimball said. "We simply feel Negroes would not be comfortable on our campus. There is not a single Negro family living here in Provo." So he's repeating the letter that they would send out. "This creates quite a social problem for Negroes wishing to come to our school." And then what I write in the book is William Barrett and Eddie Kimball both knew the real reason the school didn't recruit black students. They just didn't want to admit it. Unlike Native Americans, Polynesians, Pacific Islanders, and other students of color whom the school recruited and touted in its promotional literature, Mormon theology deemed black people cursed. So they're coming to this realization, Eddie Kimball and Barrett and others, that, you know, we can't say that publicly. So we have to take a different tack to sort of keep them at bay. But that's really what's going on here. And we're going to find out soon in this podcast series that this whole idea that you recruit every race and ethnicity out there except black people, that's going to come out to the federal authorities, and BYU is going to pay a stiff price for this.
Yeah.
All right. So what is it? You know, this LBJ, John F. Kennedy Jr. dies in 1963. LBJ takes over and is the reason why the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed. If anybody wants one of the best books ever written on American history, read Robert Caro's Master of the Senate about LBJ. It's an incredible read, but LBJ helps the Civil Rights Act get passed in 64. And it is another 4 years until things really get hot for BYU. So what happens in 68 that turns up the heat on BYU?
Well, when we talk about the Civil Rights Act of 64, I wouldn't say the final, but it's the culmination of the government's efforts in the previous, say, 15 years to integrate society. I mean, the first domino that goes down is Brown versus the board in 54, but that was just public education. So it integrates public education, but restaurants and bus stations and zoos and swimming pools and all of that, the rest of the country is still segregated. And by 1964, largely the result of Dr. King and his allies, which include a lot of really women that go unnoticed in this heroic story. Dr. King sort of gets all the attention, but there's so many incredible women who are at the vanguard of this. And Dr. King would admit that. They lead to the Civil Rights Act of 64. Dr. King had been pestering John Kennedy to implement civil rights legislation. Kennedy, being the politician that he was, knew that it needed to be done, but didn't want to do it because he was afraid of offending the Southern vote that helped get him elected in 1916, a very close election against Richard Nixon. So Kennedy resisted. And that by the spring of 1963, when a guy named Gene Bull Connor in Alabama, the public commissioner there, turned his hoses on children who are marching with adults marching, they turned attack dogs. People are watching this on the nightly news, and it was horrifying to them. A guy named Medgar Evers was murdered in June of 1963 in his driveway. He worked for the NAACP. a white supremacist had shot him from across the street, and his wife came to the door and saw her husband dying on the doorsteps. The two little children were there too. August of 63 is the Million Man March in Washington, D.C., the I Have a Dream speech that mesmerizes the nation. By September of 63, 4 little girls are shot or blown up. The Klan bombs their church when they're there in September of 63. So Kennedy recognizes this has to be dealt with. It won't go away. And so in the summer and spring of 63, he starts to change tact on civil rights and decides that, damn, whatever happens in the future to my political career, I'm going full steam ahead with this. So he starts to propose legislation, and then he gets murdered in November of 63, as you mentioned, John. And then Lyndon Johnson then picks up the torch, the civil rights torch. And by July of 64, the following year, so just, less than a year after Kennedy's murder, it gets passed into law. And what people don't realize is there is a provision of the Civil Rights Act of 64 that would affect a lot of institutions like BYU that harbored discriminatory policies. This is Title VI. And what Title VI said was that the federal government could defund any institutions that had discriminatory policies. And what that means is that if students had, a GI Bill, if they had a federal student loan, or if their faculty were receiving science grants, that would all be taken away. And so that was the federal government's way of saying, look, we're going to shut you down unless you abide by the results of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so, but to go one step further, it's one thing to have those policies in place, and another to make it a priority to go after institutions that discriminate. And so Lyndon Johnson gave the Justice Department its marching orders. We want you to identify schools, universities that have low Negro enrollments, the memo said. And that's what happens. And so BYU is one of many universities in the 60s that get swept up in this dragnet. And by the mid-60s, when BYU had to report how many Black students were there, I have the report. They sent it in. And there were 3 Black students at BYU in 65 when they sent in the report. Wow. And then it took them a little while to get the government's, priorities in order and, the people in the field and all of that. But by April of 1968, Wilkinson received a letter saying that you're going to be under federal investigation for civil rights violations. And Wilkinson panicked because only 3 African Americans were at the school, and he was just beside himself, knowing that he was now going to draw the ire of the federal government.
Yeah. It is really interesting. I mean, just thinking about, the church is much larger and more has more economic means today than it did back then. But it's really interesting that they were kind of, well, as far as I can see in your book, kind of caught off guard as to how the Civil Rights Act could impact BYU and not lobbying like they do today for religious exemptions back then. It was kind of like, oh, they're already going to do an investigation based on something that was passed 4 or 5 years ago. That was kind of interesting. Do we have any sense that the Brethren knew this was eventually going to happen when they were opposing civil rights? I think there was some mentioning of BYU back then when they were opposing the Civil Rights Act. Is that something that they saw coming? Do you know, Matt?
Yeah, they did, because Wilkinson's a lawyer, and some of his top men in his cabinet are all lawyers. Mm. And so this had been talked about ever since the end of World War II, not just at places like BYU, but institutions in general. What is the government's role over private institutions? And a number of private universities, whether it's Hillsdale College in Michigan or Liberty University or Bob Jones University in South Carolina, these are conservative evangelical universities. They had been not wanting the government to impose its rules on who they admitted into their student body. And of course, I'm talking about Black people. And so what Bob Jones did in the late 50s is that they said, we don't want the government telling us we have to admit Black people, so we're just going to not take any government aid. And so that was the presumption was, if we reject government aid, if our students just pay out of pocket and our faculty don't accept science grants, then they can't tell us what to do. And so this is all uncharted territory in case law, because that's what happens when things like this get litigated. The courts often look at case law. What did previous courts say on the matter, and why? They're not beholden to prior rulings, but they certainly take them into consideration. And so the case law wasn't where it needed to be, and that would get worked out by the mid to late 60s. There becomes a mounting body of case law that simply suggests that you can't hide behind the First Amendment to discriminate. And I know that we can make all kinds of parallels with LGBTQ rights today.
Yeah.
But in the 1960s, that's what they were worried about, particularly in the face of a larger movement for racial equality. And so they thought these private schools thought, including BYU, thought that they could get around the government's dictates if they rejected federal funding. And Ezra Taft Benson, who never liked the Department of Education, it had just popped up in the late 50s during his second term in the agricultural department. They didn't call it that then. We call it the Department of Education today. It was called something similar, but it popped up so that it was a government bureaucracy that would oversee the nation's schools, but also oversee the science race that the government was undertaking at the time during the Cold War against the Soviets in terms of space race and all of that stuff. So that was the component behind the Department of Education in the late 50s. And Benson didn't like any of this stuff. And so he proposed to the Brethren in the 60s that we ought to follow Bob Jones's rule and cut off all federal assistance. And some of his fellow apostles on the board, they just said, including Wilkinson, weirdly enough, because Wilkinson was a fellow conservative like Benson, but recognized that if we cut off all federal assistance, we're going to lose a lot of students because they can't afford to come here, paying on their own dime.
Yeah. Yeah. Just thinking about what happened here and this investigation. Now, this makes a lot more sense to me because I remember studying Title IX a couple years ago, and how when Title IX was passed in 1972, Elder Oaks was already president of BYU, and he would be become very active in having Congress pass really robust religious exemptions for Title IX. And that's likely because they had already had probably bad experiences with not being super active with Title VI, seems like, as far as requesting from Congress these religious exemptions, which is kind of what caused them to be under federal investigations and the pain that they suffered during that time. Seems like.
Yeah, there's no doubt that Title IX is going to pose problems for BYU too, because in the early 70s, Title IX suggests that you can't penalize women in hiring practices.
Right.
And BYU had this, had this policy that that they weren't going to hire married LDS women, that their role was to be at home with their children. But the government thought, wait a minute, if these women are qualified and they're applying for a job, they should be able to get that position regardless of their family situation. Yeah. And so that became a really difficult, sticky point for Dallin Oaks and his presidency.
Yeah, yeah.
So, Matt, before we jump into the protests and the investigation, just to put a fine point on it, what was the racial makeup of BYU's football team and other athletic teams sort of 1968 and prior, just to kind of make it really clear?
Boy, it's none, as far as I know.
None.
In fact, I'll stand corrected on this if somebody, wants to correct me, but the first black athlete that comes to BYU, at least on the football team, wasn't until I think 1970, 71.
Right.
So before 68, they didn't have any black athletes. And I've talked to, not to put too fine a point on this, but I've talked to some black men who are obviously older today, but they played against BYU in the 60s. And it was, black athletes football playing against an all-white football team. It was not pretty. I mean, the racial epithets that a lot of the BYU kids would use. I mean, when you're conditioned to see people as cursed, and less valiant and all of that stuff, one can imagine that you're not going to have, the most gracious things to say about them, even if it is on a competitive football environment. I mean, some of these BYU kids were crossing the line in some of the racial slurs they would use. And of course, it's not just the BYU kids who are doing this. It's happening nationally. BYU kids are just part of a larger national discourse. And one can imagine that these BYU kids hadn't been around Black people either. And so when you're not around somebody else, it's easy to demonize them.
Yeah. Okay, so which happens first, or does it matter? Where do you want to go? Do you want to start with the investigations or start with the protests? And I didn't realize it all kind of started with UTEP, University of Texas at El Paso. In my mind, it was always like Stanford or University of Wyoming, but the protests start, in your book at least, with UTEP. But do we want to do the protests or the investigation first?
Well, let's set the stage. So when Wilkinson received the notice that the feds were going to investigate them, 2 days later is when the University of Texas, El Paso, the protest began. And of course, at the time in April of 1968, when UTEP, the protest began, nobody realized that would be the first domino of many that would protest, not just BYU football, but basketball, track, wrestling. I mean, they ran the gamut. And I was absolutely shocked when I started this research how many institutions were involved. But here's a quote against one of the athletes who protested BYU. It says, "You've got to understand how we feel. Those Mormons say we're the mark of Cain and that we can't go to heaven because we're Black. Man, I just don't want to associate with those people in any way." And so UTEP, give you a little story why UTEP. UTEP had a young African-American sociology professor who was an activist. He was just hell-bent on going after institutions, particularly religious institutions that had discriminatory policies. He's the same guy that had worked with the 2 Olympian athletes in the 1968 Mexico City Olympics, where they stood on the podium and they held up their fists in solidarity, signifying Black power. Do you remember that?
Yeah. And tell us quickly his name and whether he was white or Black, just because
he's Black, and his name is Harry Edwards.
Okay, and he's Black. Okay.
He's a professor at he's at UTEP for a short while, and he's also at San Jose State. And so Harry Edwards, who's the mastermind behind this very, very public demonstration in Mexico City. I mean, the Olympics, right? It's supposed to be brotherhood and solidarity. And here you have these 2 high-profile Black American athletes raising their hand, signifying Black power. Well, Harry Edwards is the one that's starting to foment this opposition against BYU and the LDS Church. I don't want to give him 100% of the credit, but he deserves a lot of the credit for organizing some of these early student protests. And the UTEP students,
just for a quick little reference, I'll throw the visual up because it's pretty important.
Yes.
They're wearing black gloves, is that right? And
they're wearing black gloves, which, if your listeners take the time, you can look up what all this means: poverty, racial oppression, and you'll learn later that they get their medals stripped from them. It's not a good moment in terms of an image for the United States. But the guy behind this, working with these 2 athletes, is Harry Edwards, and he's the same guy that's organizing the protest at UTEP and other places as well. And Harry Edwards said something interesting. He said, if they, meaning the LDS Church, if they don't change their policies, we'll close them up. I'm not even sure what that means. There he is. We'll close them up. We'll shut the university down. We'll make life difficult. He didn't say what that meant, but those are the words he used. We'll close them up. And so the UTEP situation was interesting because of his influence, but also that there was a policy on the UTEP campus that they too could not date white girls. And so it wasn't just BYU that had this policy. UTEP and other places did as well. And so these athletes are already upset, being told that they can't date certain people. And so they decide to take their ire out on BYU. And one of the things that the UTEP student says that's particularly bothersome to Ernest Wilkinson is they asked one of the athletes, and there were about, let's see, how many athletes were there? There were about 9 of them that refused to go to BYU. And their coach wasn't happy about it at the time. But Sports Illustrated asked Dave Morgan, one of the athletes, why did you guys boycott BYU? And he said, quote, "The Mormons teach that Negroes are descended from the devil. Who the hell wants to go? Who the hell wants to go up there and run your tail off in front of a bunch of spectators who think you've got horns?" And, this is the stuff that's being bandied about in the national news press. And, of course, Wilkinson and the board, they're just horrified that people think that the church teaches that Black people are descendants from the devil. And now, I'm not in public relations, and probably neither are you guys, but it doesn't take a genius to figure out this is bad PR.
Yeah.
This is bad PR. And the fact that he's got the ear of Sports Illustrated is huge, because Sports Illustrated is the biggest sports medium in the United States in the late 60s. And a lot of newspapers will pick up that interview that Sports Illustrated does, and they'll run them in their own reprints. And so it's being circulated everywhere. In the Wilkinson papers at BYU, I got to hand it to the guy. He always kept, it's great for people like me, scholars, but he always kept all of these articles in his private papers. And, it's kind of like, Ernest, you already have the story. Why do you need 15 other reprints from different newspapers? Well, he's following this carefully. And people will send him this stuff all the time, too, trying to keep him abreast about, the bad publicity. And so Wilkinson's angry about that quote, and he issues a public relations statement right away. And it says, quote, "We do not discriminate because of race, and we have Negro students in our student body."
And there was like two. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, and I write, this is what I write: "Left unmentioned was the number of such students, 3, and the fact that BYU didn't recruit them." So, he's trying to maintain the church's policies, but he's taking heat for it because there are so few people.
Really quickly, I don't mean to go too much in the weeds, but have you done any investigation into who the 2 or 3 Black BYU students were, how they got there, and how they were allowed to be there? Why they weren't kicked off or discouraged or run out by the board?
Yeah. One of the students there is a good friend of mine, Darius Gray.
He was a BYU student. He was one of my first Mormon Stories interviews. He was a BYU student in the late 60s?
He was.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, he joined the church in 1964 in Colorado Springs, not far from where I live. So Darius and I have this shared Colorado history. And then, I think 64, 65, he went to BYU for the first time. And so he's there when all this is going down.
Oh, wow.
And just a funny little story about this, that in the board of trustees minutes that I have.
Wait, Darius Gray, wasn't he one of the Genesis group?
Yes, he was one of the founders of Genesis. Yeah.
We're going to talk more about him in detail when we get to chapter 6. But anyway, in the board of trustees meeting minutes I have, it says that one of our Negroes is giving us a hard time on campus. And it doesn't really go into details about the hard time. And so I've teased Darius about this over the years. And I think that was you, wasn't it, Darius? Huh? Fess up. And anyway, he's got a great sense of humor. He just smiles and laughs. All right. So, and I asked Darius, I said, just on a serious note, I said, what was it like going to BYU in the 60s as one of 3 Black students? And he says, the first thing I was told when I was on campus by the dean of student life was that I was not to date white girls. And, he said, I said, how did it make you feel? And he said, well, frustrated. I felt like, college is a time to date, and people usually meet their spouses on a college campus. And here I'm told that I can't date, 99.9% of the students. And, it really is a tough situation for Black Latter-day Saints, because on the one hand, they're taught to marry within the faith, right? To marry another Black Latter-day Saint, but also that you should marry within your race.
Yep.
And so Darius was left in a really difficult position. Either you marry a white Latter-day Saint woman, or you marry a Black woman who's not LDS.
And if he marries a white LDS woman, doesn't the belief was that he would pass the curse to her?
The belief would be that he would pass the curse to her
and her children, and their children. Yeah.
And their children. And of course, the white LDS woman is taught growing up that you're to marry a righteous priesthood holder in the temple. And obviously, Darius, if the person that he did marry a white woman, he did marry a white woman. You know, obviously they couldn't go to the temple because that was before the ban was lifted.
Wow.
Real quickly, Matt, I also just want to share one other photo. I was able to find a photo of Joseph Ray, who was the president, apparently the president of UTEP, you know, by 1968. And I just want to call attention to one other dynamic that I think is going to be important to know. And that's basically just the athletic conference dynamic, because at the time in the late 60s, BYU was a member of the Western Athletic Conference, or the WAC, and Joseph Ray was making a stink about whether BYU should even be allowed to continue to play in the Western Athletic Conference. Is there anything about that you want to talk about?
Yeah, that's huge. So Joseph Ray, the president, he tells Wilkinson, he says, look, you can tell me you're not racist at all, but the proof's in the pudding. The fact that you only have 3 Negro students tells me all I need to know. And essentially what he said was, your denunciations of racism ring hollow until there are more Black students on your campus. And so these guys, these 2 presidents are exchanging letters, and Wilkinson's doing his best to say we're not racist. Look at our literature. We don't have anything that says that Black people aren't welcome here. Of course, he doesn't talk about that letter that they would send Black people that we talked about. So he's trying to convince them that they're not racist. And his views were undermined by this gadfly, this guy named John Fitzgerald. And I want to take a moment and weave Fitzgerald into this story. Fitzgerald was a one-time seminary teacher in the late 1950s. So he taught seminary for a short period before he went back to graduate school to get his doctorate in education. He would later become a superintendent and work for a school district. Very gifted writer, smart guy, but always, even as a seminary teacher, was always profoundly bothered by the ban. And he would write these lengthy letters to President McKay, and he would say, "Dear President, I just don't understand. This is what the gospel teaches, love and harmony. But yet we have this terribly divisive policy. How could this be?" And essentially, he's doing what Lo Bennion was doing to the president. Although Fitzgerald was being a little bit more edgy in some of it, the way he expressed himself. And so Fitzgerald is reading about Wilkinson's denials of racism in the press. And Fitzgerald was responding to Wilkinson's, who was responding to Dave Morgan, the Black athlete, that we don't believe that Black people are devils and all of that stuff. Fitzgerald was reading about these denunciations in the press. And oh my goodness, I shouldn't laugh. It makes me, I'm not laughing. I'm just like, it's bemused. Ironic. I don't know. Bemused is the right word. It's sad is what it is. But so Fitzgerald reads the denunciations about the racism that Morgan was talking about and that Wilkinson was disputing. And he writes to the Salt Lake Tribune and he says that it's true. The church does teach this stuff. And then they go through, and he also sends a letter to Joseph Ray, UTEP president. He said, whatever Wilkinson's telling you, it's wrong. Here's the proof. And he goes through this lengthy dissertation about all the quotes from Joseph Fielding Smith and other leaders who had talked about Black skin representing darkness and the sign of the devil. Quotes John Taylor that Black people needed to have representation after the flood through Satan. I mean, really hard stuff. And
it's published in the Salt Lake Tribune as well?
Some of it is, a tiny bit.
Okay.
Most of the work he's doing is done in private to Joseph Ray.
Okay.
And Fitzgerald copies in Wilkinson. So Wilkinson's not in the dark. He knows what's being sent to Ray. So essentially, a former seminary teacher is undermining all of Wilkinson's mea culpas about racism.
This is crazy.
The evidence is right there. He's giving quotes from The Way to Perfection. And
from a living prophet, right? Because at the time, Joseph Fielding Smith was still part of the quorum.
He wasn't the prophet, Gerardo, at that point, but he was a prophet. He was a senior member of the 12. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Not to, just for your listeners out there who may not be LDS, each of the top 15 men in the governing body, they're sustained as prophets, seers, and revelators. So they each have those prophetic gifts as they're set apart. But there's only one person who is authorized to exercise all of the rights and authorities to run the church, and that would be the church president or prophet. They're used interchangeably, the president, the prophet. And the president, the prophet is chosen not by democracy or a vote, but they're chosen because they're the most senior apostle in the church. So if you want to be the church president, then it depends on when you're called into the quorum of the 12. That's how it works. This isn't like a papacy where you have a conclave over a period of, say, 2 weeks and you choose a new pope from the College of Cardinals. This is something different. If you want to be the church president, you've got to A, survive, not die, and B, be in the quorum for a long time. All right, so when they get word of what Fitzgerald's doing, Wilkinson is upset. He sulks to Elder Spencer W. Kimball, who's an apostle. He said, quote, "This is just another example of where Jack Mormons causes more trouble than outsiders." And a Jack Mormon is an interesting word in Mormon culture. It is somebody who was a member or still is a member, but doesn't believe with all of its teachings and sometimes becomes vocal. We don't use that term today, Jack Mormon. But in the mid-20th century, that was a term that meant somebody who was sort of disillusioned with some Mormon teachings. These are members. Yeah. And when Wilkinson says that Jack Mormons give us more trouble than outsiders, what he means by that is this person has been on the inside. They know what Joseph Fielding Smith and other authorities have written, and outsiders don't know that. But he knows that, and he's using that against us.
Mm-hmm.
It's weird that they're not expressing anger at past racist statements or past harmful policies made by other church leaders. It's the outspoken critics who often come from a place of love or care or concern or wanting the church to be better. They're the ones that kind of receive the ire, not the past leaders that kind of put us in the tough situation to begin with.
Well, I think, with the church leaders, I mean, we can't assume that just because and you weren't making that assumption, John, so I don't want to attribute that to you, but we can't assume that just because people don't speak out against Joseph Fielding Smith, that somehow we can take that as tacit acknowledgement that they agree with him, because that's not the case at all. I mean, Hugh Brown does not agree with any of this stuff. And there's stuff on race from Joseph Fielding. And there are some other apostles and church presidents like David O. McKay and Spencer Kimball. They don't agree with a lot of what was in The Way to Perfection, but they're not going to go out and denounce him publicly. And the reason is because they don't want to, if you denounce somebody's prophetic authority, then that could cast light on the other's prophetic authority. And so the brethren, when you come into that quorum, it's kind of like politics, right? One of the first rules in politics is you don't denounce your own party, even if there's something dumb going on. And you don't want to undermine, the next election. And that's what's going on here. And so typically they keep their criticisms very private. They do not want criticisms to come out. We're going to see that later on in this book with Mormon doctrine. There have been a number of general authorities who have issues with that book, but they're not going to say that publicly to the saints. And that's what's going on here. And what you see in private is that even some of the general authorities who may agree with Joseph Fielding Smith's views, that they recognize that those views could cause or pose problems for the church. And so they're like rolling their eyes because this is a senior apostle who has a lot of authority and a lot of respect in high church circles. And they're seeing how this book that he wrote in 1931 is it's causing them problems during the civil rights movement. And, what do you do about it? Once it's in print, it's in print.
Yeah.
So, all right. One thing that's instructive about this little exchange is, as a historian, I always look at context, and I think that's meaningful. Just after this whole Fitzgerald nasty letter to Joseph Ray saying, "Hey, look, it really truly is. They are racist," and Wilkinson's upset. Alvin Dyer, who was in the first presidency at the time, he was a third counselor. Sometimes the church leaders would bring in an additional counselor if one fell ill and couldn't perform the responsibilities. So they would bring in a third counselor to sort of help. Alvin Dyer was brought in 1967 to help with an aging Hugh Brown. And there are some other issues too that I don't think we need to get into at this moment. But Dyer complained to the first presidency just after this Fitzgerald thing. He said that he was tired of members taking constant pot shots at church leaders. And it was shortly thereafter, in April of 1968, where the brethren decide that they don't want to say anything more in public about church racial teachings, the less valiant pre-existent stuff, the curse, anything that they say should be positive and brief. That's what they decide in this first presidency meeting. And because outsiders, particularly during this national push for racial equality, they're not going to understand these difficult church teachings on race. So let's just make it positive and brief.
Yeah, this is a pivotal moment in church history, I think, because this is when all these teachings start, becoming quiet down. The brethren are not going to keep talking about it. And then it eventually will allow for decades later to be able for the brethren to say, oh, those were just folklore. They were so long ago. It was just the opinions of some men. And then because the brethren just stopped talking about it. So this was a really important point in history, in my opinion, as far as how you put it on your book. Would you agree with that, Matt?
Yeah, for our story here, it absolutely is critical because it's the civil rights movement that forces them to change the messaging about the church's racial theology. And a podcaster asked me not too long ago that it was Gordon Hinckley. And I said, no. Gordon Hinckley didn't come up with this idea that, we don't know why the ban existed. That predates President Hinckley. This is a civil rights thing. And so when they talk about saying things that are positive and brief about the church's racial theology, which is to ignore the rationales behind the ban, the idea would be, we don't know why God has denied Black men and women the rights of the church. And as I've pointed out and elsewhere, it's hard to sustain that position when there's been so much written by the church leaders about why the ban occurred, including a first presidency statement of 1949. And so the "we don't know" line never had any substance to it. It was just a PR throwaway line that the leaders would use well into the 21st century. And by the 21st century, it'll shift again, where a handful of years they'll start to call it folklore, which is also problematic because a number of BYU professors by that point are calling the race teachings hard doctrine.
Yeah. So give us some details about. Oh, sorry, John.
I have one quick thing I wanted to say before we moved on.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead. Sorry.
So I was going to say one thing. They talk about critics taking pot shots. I just wonder what the difference is between well-intended members just confused about and trying to understand and or hold leaders accountable for past things said, harmful things said, contradictory things said. The first thing I'm just wondering is, what's the difference between just sincere members trying to understand and have things be consistent versus critics making pot shots? The second thing I just wanted to slow down and really make sure we covered was this paragraph on page 136, where you kind of show when the brethren know that there's a PR problem with a doctrine or a theology, what they never do is sort of like hold a general conference, tell the world and the general membership, we've made a mistake, there's a problem, we're making a fix, here's where we got it wrong, we're sorry, and now here's how we're going to fix it. This paragraph kind of in the middle of page 136 gives just a more accurate sense for what they do with the messaging. Do you want to read that, or do you want me to read that, Matt?
Yeah, go ahead, John, then I'll respond to your first part of your question.
Okay. So it says, this decision supplemented an ongoing public relations effort, so this is a PR effort, to bolster the church's image with Black people. For example, the first presidency removed offensive chapters from the Portuguese edition of The Way to Perfection. We talked about that in a previous episode. They denied permission for BYU religion professor James Clark to publish the 1949 First Presidency Statement on Race and Priesthood in a multi-volume edition called The Messages of the First Presidency. So they intentionally withheld a First Presidency Statement affirming the priesthood ban and the reasons for it. They intentionally withheld that from the membership. They refused to print a controversial address dealing with race and lineage by Church Patriarch Eldridge G. Smith, quote, because of the present turmoil over the Negro question, close quote. they forbade BYU students from writing on the quote, Negroes' position in the Mormon Church, questioning why students would choose, quote, this subject, particularly at the present time. So they're telling BYU students not to research or write on certain topics. And then, moreover, they instructed the brethren not to publish the church's interracial marriage teachings, affirming, quote, that any instruction should be of an oral nature. So they shift from written codified policies to maintaining those policies, but converting them to oral only, so there's no receipts or evidence anymore of the policy. And then finally, Apostle Smith denied that they ever taught that Black people were an inferior race. So they just start saying, we never taught that. We never, that was never something that we did. Those are really important things to note on how the brethren deal with inconvenient doctrinal, theological, or PR problems.
No, they're feeling the weight of it. It's a civil rights era. They're getting beat up daily in the national news press. And so the interracial marriage one struck me there because, it's no secret that this is a church teaching. And, by the civil rights era, by the end of the era, you start to see public opinion polls and more Americans are supportive of interracial marriage. And when they said that, those instructions that they have to be oral in nature, that's around the time that the Supreme Court had struck down interracial marriage laws. This is Lovington, Virginia. So, they're really responding to a lot of these national movements with respect to keeping out the 1949 First Presidency Statement and this multi-volume edition called The Messages of the First Presidency. They specifically said that they didn't want certain things that were controversial or that could be perceived as controversial. So it wasn't just the 49 statement. It was also some statements they had issued years earlier dealing with polygamy, plural marriage. And so they're just trying to, tamp down the criticisms because the criticism is coming regardless, but they don't want to make themselves, put themselves on the firing line even any more than they have to. And let me give you one example from the Eldridge G. Smith quote you just read, John. So you read about that they didn't want to publish one of his addresses because of the present situation with the Negro question. I didn't say what the address was. I put it in a footnote, I think. But in November of 1966, Eldridge G. Smith gave this is during the Civil Rights Movement, 2 years after the Civil Rights Act was passed, and a year after Malcolm X was murdered, and 2 years before King gets murdered. Just everything's at a high point here, it seems like. And here you have Eldridge G. Smith giving a devotional assembly at BYU. And, he talks about patriarchal blessings because he's the church patriarch. He talks about lineage and the purpose of blessings and all of that. And then he goes into this little rant about Black people and how when they die, they'll be servants to white people in the next life. You're like, you got to be kidding me. 1966, you just go outside and see where the winds are blowing. And this is so radical. Only a handful of hardliners who believe this, one of whom we've talked about already, Mark Peterson. But to say this at this late hour in 1966, holy cow, talk about tone deaf. And Harold B. Lee, so Ernest Wilkinson, he's in the audience that day, and Wilkinson's very conservative, very racist. But even Wilkinson recognizes that the patriarch's gone too far. And so after the address is over, they're supposed to clean them up and publish them. And Wilkinson is in a predicament, doesn't think that this ought to be published. And so he reaches out to David O. McKay and he says, President McKay, this is what the patriarch just did at BYU. And he let him read a copy of the address. And so McKay, adjusts his glasses and stares at it. And he looks up at Ernest Wilkinson. They were meeting at church headquarters. He looks up at Ernest Wilkinson. And he said, I can't believe that some people of ours don't have better judgment. In other words, the elderly church president was saying, I can't believe that he's doing this in public in 1966. And so the president says, we're not going to publish this. You tell him. And so Wilkinson has to write a letter to the patriarch and says, President McKay, and by this time they brought in Harold Lee too. President McKay, and I guess you need reinforcement maybe, I don't know. But President McKay and Elder Lee do not want this published, and therefore we're not going to publish it. Sincerely, Ernest Wilkinson. And I don't have Patriarch Smith's response, but that was not the first time that Ernest Wilkinson had to send out a letter like that telling one of his guests that we're not going to publish your address. Benson's another one, when he gave this very, very challenging address called The Book of Mormon Warns America in May of 1968. They didn't publish that either. So that's what's going on here. A lot of that stuff. And somebody asked Apostle Smith, about what he said in The Way to Perfection. He just denies it. I never said that black people were inferior to white people. And, that's a tough thing to do because it's in print. It's right here. But he's backing off of this. And maybe it represents his views, but it certainly represents a growing awareness that, you can't be as forthcoming about race teachings as you once were. To your first point, John, about people getting in trouble, Latter-day Saints, you ask about what happens if you have legitimate questions about this? Where is the church line? And the church, in my opinion, I think your listeners and anybody else may disagree with me, but in my research and my thinking on this over the years, they've been remarkably consistent about what constitutes that line and where it's crossed. And that's when you go public. And so Eugene England, who was a young graduate student, he'll be an important part of our story in future episodes, but Eugene England was a graduate student at Stanford University in the late 1960s. He would later become a professor of English literature at BYU before they fired him in 1998, or pushed him out, which is essentially being fired. And anyway, England went to Joseph Fielding Smith and he just said, look, President Smith, this is when Smith was president of the Quorum of the 12. Look, President Smith, do I have to believe in the less valiant and pre-existent stuff in order to stay in the church's good graces? Because I don't believe in it. And Smith opened up the scriptures and started to read to him, which is what he usually would do. Like, I'm going to walk you through the scriptures and convince you that this is the right belief. And that's what he did. And England just said, I'm sorry, President Smith, but I don't see it. I don't read those verses the way you read them. And then Joseph Fielding Smith said something that was really, I'll never forget this. He told England, he said, you don't have to believe this to stay in the good graces of the church. You just can't publicize it. And so that's what England did, is that he walked away from that meeting kind of like a burden had been lifting off his shoulders, because it was pricking his moral conscience that he had to believe in the church's race teachings in order to be a good member. And the senior apostle was saying, no, you really don't have to do that. You can believe what you want to believe. Just don't talk publicly about your opposition to these teachings. And the people that got themselves into trouble in the late 1960s and into the 70s were the people who wrote op-ed pieces, Latter-day Saints who wrote op-ed pieces in the Salt Lake Tribune in particular, the New York Times, and the people who would stand up in sacrament meeting in their local ward where they were worshiping, their worship community, in which they would criticize the church's teachings. I'm thinking of one man who's still alive today. He's in his 80s. He wrote a letter to N. Eldon Tanner of the governing first presidency, and he challenged him to a debate on the race issue. And I'm just like, I don't think that this very busy man was going to take the time to debate somebody in a public forum. I mean, in the letter, he spelled out the time, the date, and the location where the debate would be. Basically,
it's like a high noon showdown.
Yeah, show up, and surprise when President Tanner didn't show up.
Oh gosh.
So, but that man, I should tell you, if you're doing that sort of thing, you're on the high road to apostasy, and that's what happened to him. So he got excommunicated in 1977, and so that's what's going on. A lot of people are disagreeing with the ban. Lowell Benyon is another great example. The brethren know he does not support the ban, but he's not publicly writing these newspaper editorials. And he got fired from his job, admittedly, because he's telling things to his students that were contrary to at least a lot of the leaders in their thinking. But he never went public with his opposition in terms of outside of the church's media outlets. And so that's why, Benyon didn't get into further trouble after he was fired, because he knew where to draw the line. But other Latter-day Saints didn't. They thought that putting pressure on the brethren publicly could produce the desired results. And when that didn't happen, they were bitter.
With the exception of Sterling McMurrin and Huey Brown. We'll talk about them next episode. Yeah. All right, so let's talk about the investigation and its arrival at BYU. Should we go there?
Yeah. So they get the letter, and the big day comes in May. A 3-man investigatory team came to BYU.
And this is 68, right?
May of 68, yeah. Okay. And one of the men, a guy named Hollis Bach, he's the lead investigator. And I tried to interview him a few years ago, and I missed him by a month. The guy died, I think, in his 90s. Yeah, I wanted to interview him. And, it's hard to know with people's memory capacity when they're in their 90s, of course. But I have his private papers. And so I got to see sort of, Bach's views and all of this. But so Bach and his 2 assistants, they were sent in from they were part of the Department of Justice. And I think they were called the Department of Health and Human Services or something like that back in the day. But that's what they are. They're a subsidiary of the Department of Justice, and they're all lawyers. And so when they decided to go to BYU in May, the board of trustees was ready for them. One of the things that Wilkinson had done prior to the board's visit, and this is after he received the letter indicating that they would be investigated for civil rights violations, is that Wilkinson held a meeting with some of his top lieutenants, and they wanted to look at their literature. Hey guys, let's make sure there's nothing discriminatory in any of our literature. This had already been on their mind for a number of years at that point.
I love it.
Because Bob Jones, just to draw a contrast, Bob Jones in South Carolina, they put right on their literature, Negroes are not welcome.
Wow. Oops.
And that's what got them in trouble with the feds.
Yeah. Wilkinson at that point had decided to not take federal funding, right?
No. They talked about that, but they backed off it because a number of people on the board, they said, hey, Wilkinson.
No, I'm talking about Bob Jones.
Oh, yes, Bob Jones.
That's correct. Bob Jones had decided that, but BYU was still not willing to take that step, even though there was some people in the board advocating for it.
If Elder Benson had his way, they would have done it. But other people said, if you do that, you're gonna end BYU. We won't have a student body.
Right.
So, so they try. So what they do is they look at their literature to make sure there's nothing wrong there. They send out letters to local businesses and area offices, including the NAACP, the Bi-City Urban League and Civil Rights Organization. And BYU sends out letters saying, hey, look, we don't discriminate. So they're trying to go on this preemptive campaign to show that, hey, we accept all races and ethnicities. You should know this. And of course, they don't. They want to discourage Black people and biracial people from coming to BYU, but they're just saying the direct opposite to these civil rights organizations. And they want to be able to tell the investigatory team that, hey, look at the letters we just sent out. Look at our literature. So we don't discriminate. And one of the things that they tell, or the investigatory team, they asked Wilkinson is they said, well, on your literature, it says that you've got all these Native Americans, Polynesians, Maori, Brazilians, Mexicans, and people from the Caribbean. That's wonderful. Sounds like you have a pretty diverse university and that you recruit them because it's on your promotional literature. Where are the Negroes? And Wilkinson thought this was sort of a badge of honor. We're diverse. Look at all the people here. And he doesn't realize that what he thinks is helping their cause is actually hurting them.
Yeah.
So where are the Negroes, as they ask? And so he gives the same line that Eddie Kimball, the athletic director, had been given, and Barrett, that they don't come here not because of our policies. They come here because of their own choice. They know that there's not a strong Black population in the community. And, it doesn't take a genius to see through that, right? Particularly when you ask a follow-up question, is there anything in your theology that may pose a barrier? And that's where it gets really hard for Wilkinson, because Wilkinson, I'm going to say something that could be controversial to some people, but I'm going to stand by it. Wilkinson, being a smart man, he's Harvard educated. He has a very facile understanding of Mormon theology. He's been in the church his entire life. He grew up in Ogden, Utah. And you hear him talk and read some of his letters describing things. You would think that he just joined the church 6 months earlier. And I guess what that tells me is he wasn't really much into theology. Oh. He once said that I only read things that confirm my biases. And which from a well-educated man, that's absolutely astonishing. So Reuben Clark, one of his close friends, said something similar.
Yeah.
So he's having to defend himself against all of these different racial groups at BYU, except black people. And he didn't feel comfortable explaining to the authorities the priesthood ban. And so he has the dean do it, a guy named David Yarn.
Oh, I love this.
And Dean Yarn takes some time to explain to the authorities that there is a revelatory basis for the Negro not being permitted to hold the priesthood. Those are Yarn's words. And, I don't know what Wilkinson's hoping to accomplish. It's kind of like, the authorities thinking, oh, okay, now that you explain it, that makes perfect sense.
Now that you told me that God is commanding you with black people, then I guess that's fine.
When they strongly intuit that this is a problem, Wilkinson goes to a time-honored sort of issue when there's a conflict with the federal government, and that is he hides behind the First Amendment. He says, look, you can't make us recruit black students. We're a private university, or black faculty. We're a private university. We have the right to believe what we believe. There's something called the First Amendment. And this is where it gets really dicey because Wilkinson's a lawyer. He reads case law. He knows what the Supreme Court has been ruling, upholding Lyndon Johnson's Justice Department and some of the rulings that they've issued. And so, but he's trying. Wilkinson is trying, and he reaches out to his friend, a guy named Robert Barker, who is a Latter-day Saint man. They were law partners in their Washington, D.C. law firm before Wilkinson was appointed BYU's president. And they hired him. The board had approved him. Wilkinson thought it would give more cachet if you had an outside person, outside of the BYU community, legal counsel, adjudicate and advise BYU and the church. Probably a wise thing to move it out of your backyard to, especially somebody in Washington, D.C. who's around federal bureaucrats a lot.
Yeah.
And so they asked him, they said, Wilkinson says, what do we do? What are our rights? Are we on good grounding to deny black people the priesthood or deny them entry into BYU because of our religious tenets? And Barker writes back and he says, I don't think so. The government's going in a different direction and we've got to figure this out. Wilkinson says, what about black faculty? And Barker writes back and he says, that's a different matter. I think we could probably fight that and win, but the black student population, don't think we're going to win that.
Yeah. Wow.
This is, should we go to what happens in the summer of 68?
Yeah. What happens?
Yeah. So just want to pause for a minute. The Board of Trustees, they're not used to being told what to do.
I mean, they are prophets, seers, and revelators and special witnesses of Christ. That's how they are. That's their title, and that's how they're treated within a Mormon context. So there's got to be an emperor with no clothes sort of dynamic where you just don't tell these men what to do, right? Yeah. Culturally speaking, that's what they're used to. Am I right?
Among Latter-day Saints, that's absolutely true. You don't tell the brethren what to do. You don't tell them how to run the church. And if they want your advice, they'll ask for it, but you don't give it unsolicited. That was true then. It's true today.
And Matt, I think it's important to acknowledge there's a pretty easy solution, and I'll say easy solution in air quotes, but the brethren can do the exact same thing that Bob Jones did and say, we're just not going to take federal funding. And if they stop taking federal funding, then this all goes away.
Well, no, that's not true. Bob Jones thought that all goes away, that if we cut off all financial ties with the federal government, they have no legal jurisdiction over us. And it turns out,
well, they went after their tax exempt status. Is that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Later on, Bob Jones. So 1971, they get notice. We're going to take your tax exemption status away. It takes them a few years, but by 1976, they actually strip it.
Yeah.
And it's not until like 1981 in the conservative Reagan administration where they get it back. But anyway, but that's how the government works. They can play hardball against you. And usually, when you're fighting the federal government, there's so many resources and different angles. It's just really it's an uphill battle.
Yeah.
And so Wilkinson is not dumb. Robert Barker is not dumb. But yeah, they have to go to the board. The board, many of these guys on the board are conservative, the brethren, and they come from this conservative line of thinking that if we cut off, sort of the funds, then we're free and clear. We can do what we want to do. And there's a deep division on the board. And part of it is let's cut the funds off so they can't dictate who we hire and the students that we enroll. And the other half is look at the case law. We're going to lose. So let's not go down that road. And the more pragmatic members of the board will win out. They don't cut off all federal funds, even though Benson and a few others want to. And so the board issues or the investigation team issues their ruling in about a month after their site visit. And in my book, I talk about all the things that they want them to do. And I'll just summarize essentially a couple main points. One is they want BYU to recruit Black students. They want them to go to heavily concentrated Black populations and recruit. They want them to boost their student enrollment, their Black student enrollment. And okay, here you go. So when they say population centers, that means Black cities or Black areas. They want them to recruit Black student athletes. They want them to accept Black students in the university-approved housing. You can't bring, minority students to campus and say, oh, gee, sorry, we're not going to let you lodge here. So they're going through all these different rules that BYU has to follow. And this is in May. And in June of 1968, we can talk more in detail in a minute, but in June of 68, the brethren are beside themselves. Sterling McMurrin, we'll talk more about him next episode, but Sterling McMurrin gives this NAACP address that sends the brethren reeling. And he's really takes out his filter, and he criticizes the brethren for, quote, holding a crude, superstitious Negro doctrine. And dozens and dozens and dozens of newspapers across the United States published this address or parts of the address from McMurrin. And he predicts in June of 1968 that if the church doesn't change its Negro doctrine, they're going to hemorrhage members. So that's obviously a catchy byline for the newspapers. And so the brethren are really talking about that in June of 68. And then in July, they usually take the summer off. So they're away from their offices. And it's in July when they're away from their offices where the federal authorities, Hollis Bach and his associates, they meet with Robert Barker. And they say, if you don't tell your client to follow these to comply with federal law, these 8 things that we've stipulated that you must do to comply with federal law, we'll shut you down. And we'll deny you funds. That's what they're saying. We'll deny you funds. And ultimately, if we deny you funds, we deny you research grants, ultimately you'll lose your accreditation. I mean, they're really playing hardball with Robert Barker. So Barker has to go back to his friend and former law associate, Ernest Wilkinson, and say, look, it's non-negotiable. This is what's going to happen unless we play nice. I want to share something with you guys that, let me comment about that. What are the things that Barker says to Wilkinson in reference to Bach and his team? Some of the board members are really upset because they feel like, quote, that the committee is out to get us. And on the face of it, that might be sort of a legitimate statement, because in the fall of 1968, just 4 months after the investigation commenced, Black students constituted, I'm reading from my book, about 0.03% of the student body at BYU. At the University of Utah, they totaled 0.4%. At the University of Wyoming, 0.5%. University of Colorado, 0.5%. And at the University of Arizona, 1%. And the brethren were complaining that those guys aren't under investigation. Why are we being singled out by the committee? Why do they have to get us? And I mean, that's a legitimate thing, right? If people, other universities throughout the Intermountain West have a similar student body vis-a-vis Black people, why aren't you under investigation? And it's because the church has an anti-Black theology that these other public universities don't have. And that's why BYU's singled out. So, all right. So they're having to work through these very tough issues, and the Wilkinson is going through some of the legalese with the board. He's talking to them about a Supreme Court case called Jones v. Mayer, in which the Supreme Court had ruled that Congress had the power to prohibit, quote, private acts of racial discrimination in the sale and rental of residential housing. In other words, Congress could dictate, or the Supreme Court could dictate, that you can't discriminate in residential housing. And if they can do that in Jones v. Mayer, then they can force us to accept black students. So there's this case law that Wilkinson's going to bring to the board. And the brethren return from their vacations in August, and Wilkinson is really, really upset. And he reaches out to a couple of his associates and he says, the board does not recognize the need for speed, but you and I do. He writes a memo to one of his associates. And so by November,
it's almost like they're just kind of ignoring him, right?
They don't know. Honestly, Gerardo, they don't know what to do. I don't think they're ignoring it. They don't know what to do because they resist being told they must admit black students. But on the other hand, they know it's not going to go away. This is the federal government.
Yeah.
And so they're resisting. They're stalling. And finally, Wilkinson, or actually Hollis Bach, in November of 68, October of 68, he writes Wilkinson a very sharp letter. He said, you better tell the board to make this their highest priority at their next board meeting. I mean, he's playing hardball. And so by November of 68, a month after he writes that letter, that's when they discuss it for the first time. And they're going to go through line by line the 8 recommendations that Hollis Bach and his team had recommended for BYU, which ones they'll accept, which ones they don't accept. And one of the things that they do to get the government off their backs is that Wilkinson decides to send recruitment letters to population centers in Utah and Wyoming. Because one of the recommendations was they had to make a good faith effort that they were going to recruit black students. Now, I'm going to say it again. Utah and Wyoming. How many black students do you think are in Utah and especially Wyoming in the 1960s?
Yeah.
And so this is just a little game that Wilkinson's playing. He knows it's not going to yield the results that the investigators want, but that's the game he's playing just to show that he's doing what they asked him to do, even though it's not going to work. And they're going to be on to his ruse because they told him when he said, hey, I'm going to send out recruitment letters, Utah, Wyoming. They wrote back and they said, that's fine, but we need results. And we're going to come back 1 year later and we need to see results that your recruitment is yielding enrollment, black student enrollment at the university. That's what we care about, the results, not the process, but the results.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Tough stuff. It's tough stuff. And the brethren Harold B. Lee said something interesting. He said, we'll shut this place down before we start having Negro students and black faculty, Negro faculty. We'll shut it down. I think he said that in one of those impetuous moments because in my opinion, I don't think he meant that, but that's what he said.
And I had that marked with many, many red stars in my notes. That was such a shocking thing to say. Mm-hmm. I'd rather shut down BYU than have black student athletes. Is that basically what he said?
That's pretty much what he says, and have the government telling us which faculty to hire. And a young Gordon Hinckley, who was very skilled in public relations, he'd been an apostle since 1963. So he hadn't been in the quorum very long. And he's one of the apostles. He and a guy named Richard L. Evans, they go to Harold B. Lee and they say, look, presently, you might want to rethink this. This would be damaging to the church if we were just to shut the church down or shut the school down because we didn't want to adhere to the strictures of the Civil Rights Act. That would be bad publicity. So they have to sort of talk him off the ledge. I don't think it would have happened because I can't imagine in my mind's eye that if they took a vote of the Board of Trustees to shut BYU down or adhere to the Civil Rights Act, that it would have passed. I just can't go there. I don't think that would happen. But the fact that he was just sort of putting it out there in some angry moment is really revealing about, how at least Lee views the Civil Rights Act, and also an outside authority like the government telling a private institution like BYU what to do.
Yeah. Cool.
if it's okay, let's go ahead and also include a little bit of the athletic conference part of the story as well. So I'll just read at the bottom of 146. Nor would the board grant BYU permission to recruit Negro athletes. So basically, you're writing about what they would and they wouldn't agree to, right?
Correct.
And so, have you already told us what they ended up saying they would do versus not?
Just the one letter. There are other things.
Okay, so here it writes, nor would the board grant BYU permission to recruit Negro athletes. Lee, this is Harold B. Lee, informed, this is what we're rereading what we just said. Lee informed Wilkinson that, quote, he would close BYU if we ever had a colored athlete on our teams. Then you write, but the brethren were far from unified on the subject. Apostle Evans confided to Wilkinson that, quote, not having Negro players on our teams would jeopardize BYU standing in the conference, that's the Western Athletic Conference of the WAC, and only intensify criticism against the school and the church. Others, like First Presidency counselors Brown and Tanner, that's Hugh B. Brown and N. Eldon Tanner, and Apostle Spencer B. Kimball, expressed sympathy for Evans's position. And Evans's position was what again, Matt?
His position was that that BYU, if they didn't start recruiting black athletes, they'd get kicked out of the WAC.
Right. Yeah. Brown, Hugh B. Brown, brazenly stated that the only way to satisfy the investigators, this is Brown, was to grant black men the priesthood. Of course, Brown's just going for it any chance that he can. That's First Presidency member Hugh B. Brown. And then you have, of course, the holdouts, apostles, Delbert. Is it Delbert Stapley? Is that his name? Delbert?
Yeah. Yes.
Ezra Benson, Mark E. Peterson, and Joseph Fielding Smith joined Harold B. Lee in rejecting the government's request for BYU to recruit black athletes and faculty. So anything else you want to say about the Western Athletic Conference and all the other protests that emerged? Because it was much more than just UTEP, right?
Yeah. Oh, my goodness. So in the next chapter, too, I talk a lot about Stanford and some other bigger ones, University of Washington. There's so many of them. And what I did in this book is I wanted to just highlight 3 or 4 of the protests that I think are the most important. And so I do that in chapter 6, the next chapter. And the problem with this is that if they get kicked out of the WAC because of racist policies, they're worried that no other conference will pick them up. So that's a huge concern. And also, they're talking about, this is in the late 60s, they're talking about raising money for this beautiful new basketball facility that one of the church's wealthiest members will fund, a guy named J. Willard Marriott. He'll open up his wallet and pour in millions of dollars to build this beautiful facility on the campus of BYU. It's still there today. It's called the Marriott Center. That's where the BYU basketball team is. That's where they have cultural events. And so they're talking about raising money for this big basketball facility. They desperately needed one. They were playing in the old field house that was old and decrepit and been around for decades. So they need a new facility. And gosh, if we get kicked out of the conference and we have this new facility, we're done. We're not going to be able to use it. And so Richard L. Evans, he's the one that brought up the Marriott Center. He said, gosh, we're going to really build all this beautiful building and spend millions of dollars and then not have a conference to play in? What's the point? And so he was very pragmatic about all of this stuff, as opposed to some of the hardliners who just like, let's cut it all off. We don't want to deal with this. So there is a huge schism in the quorum. And Hugh Brown, as you mentioned, I mean, you know, his go-to line was, hey guys, this is all go away if we just ordain black men to the priesthood.
I have a solution, brethren.
I have a solution. I have a solution. And they weren't in the mood to entertain his solution. So
how did this all end up for BYU? Did they reject, accept part, or accept all? How did they get the investigators off their back? And then what changes were made eventually as a result of all this pressure for BYU?
Well, of the 8 changes, you know, that they had, the big one is they had to recruit black students and athletes. They had to not only show effort but results. And Wilkinson was really just focused on the effort, and the feds were interested essentially on the results. And so how did it end? Well, in November of 1969, the athletic protests had been going on for well over a year at that point, a year and a half. It had spread from UTEP in April of 68 to dozens of other universities. It is a public relations debacle. I think in the next episode, we'll get into some of these protests, what they look like and how it happens. It's really fascinating. And the church is under heavy fire. And there are a number of presidents in the WAC who are coming to Joseph Ray's defense, the UTEP president. And the defense is, President Ray, we agree with you. We think BYU should be kicked out of the conference. They're racist. And one of the presidents who comes to that conclusion, this is astonishing for me to even grasp, and that it's the University of Utah president, who's a Latter-day Saint man, a very good Latter-day Saint man. And so he comes to the conclusion, tells Wilkinson, I agree with my fellow presidents. You guys need to change your policy or I'm going to vote to kick you out. So they schedule a time to vote, November of 68. They're going to vote. And just before they schedule a time to vote, 3 weeks earlier, Wilkinson writes this lengthy, it's like 39-page single-spaced memo to the board titled Confidential. And he tells the board, he said, they're going to have a vote in November. We will not survive this vote. We will be kicked out of the conference. We have this beautiful Marriott Center that's being planned, and we'll be out of the athletic business. And so they're really worried about that. And Wilkinson also, he admits, he said, we're in a tough position. We haven't been truthful to the federal authorities. We've been telling them that we don't discriminate, but we actually do. We tell them that we give athletic scholarships to Negroes like we would a white student if the Negro were to come here. We don't, board. We don't do that. We would never give a Negro student a scholarship because we don't want him here. So he's admitting in this very private memo that the board, he's in a tough position because he's taking heat from federal authorities and he's also taking heat from the board who don't want black students. And so he goes through the rationale in this memo and he tells the board, look, we can end this. But if you want this to go away, at least temporarily, we've got to admit and recruit black student athletes. And Brown, of course, give him the priesthood. And Wilkinson hints at that. And he says, I know, guys, it's above my pay grade, but you might want to consider giving him the priesthood. But he settles on something more practical, knowing their personalities and temperaments. Let's admit and recruit black student athletes. So that's what they do. And they write a letter. Wilkinson writes a letter to his fellow presidents and also to the WAC commissioner, the guy that oversees the conference. And he says, hey, my board just met, and we just want you to know that we're going to start recruiting black student athletes. And this is what we're going to do. And he listed the reasons how they're going to do it. We're going to target population centers in Los Angeles. So that's good. That's a black population, right? We're going to target Houston. And he mentions a few places that have black student athletes. So he was moving away from, this whole Wyoming nonsense because, you're not going to get black student athletes from Wyoming. So that's what he does. And then that's when the federal authorities back off because a year later, Wilkinson produces the results where they do have black student athletes at Brigham Young University by the following year in 1970. And that's when the feds back off. But there's still an unresolved issue, and that's black faculty.
Okay. And just because I think they bear mentioning, some of the universities that I notice who were protesting, I think you mentioned San Jose State, you mentioned Wyoming, you mentioned Stanford, you mentioned University of New Mexico, and this is all in Chapter 5. I know there's going to be more, but is it, and you mentioned University of Utah, is it safe to say that these universities all started recruiting black athletes years prior to BYU? And do you have a sense for when the critical mass of, let's just say, NCAA Division I universities started integrating?
Yeah, in the 60s. In the 60s. Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit more risky in the 50s. But in the 60s, definitely University of Utah starts to recruit. I mentioned this, I think, an episode or two ago when we were talking about the civil rights protests at Temple Square in 1965. Well, one of the people from the University of Utah was protesting was their star running back, a black student, and he was married at the time, and they had a baby. And he's out there with his baby and his wife, and they walked over to the steps of the church office building where they wanted a photo op. And it shows, I wish I had the picture, I don't, but it shows the athlete, his wife, and the baby. They're standing on the steps of the church office building, and they wanted N. Eldon Tanner of the First Presidency to know that we can't get housing in this city because we're colored.
Yeah.
And they were responding directly to something Tanner had told the press, that I know of no instances where colored people can't get housing because of their race. And this young couple was saying just the opposite.
Yeah. Okay. So BYU was years late relative to other university in terms of Black athletes. Now, in terms of like racial composition of the student body, they weren't too far behind other universities in the Mountain West, correct?
Yeah, correct. So it's the athletes that come to these schools first before they start opening up and recruiting just typical, Black students. And one of the things that Wilkinson stressed in this lengthy memo that he wrote to the board in October of '69, he said, basically, I know what you're thinking, that if we allow, Negro athletes to come here, then they're going to date white girls. Don't worry. We'll take every precaution necessary to tell them that they can't date white girls. We intend to keep interracial issues at a minimum. This is what he writes to the board in this memo. And of course, in the 1970s, you start to get more and more Black students, even though they were never going to be a huge threshold, but they start to recruit more Black students. And, you read these stories of these Black students and you can imagine how difficult it is because they're told that they can't date white people. And it's not the color of your skin. I'm not good enough. I'm inferior. I mean, all of that psychological baggage comes to bear. And then you start to get Black Latter-day Saints who go there, and they're not part of an athletic team. They join the church. Most of them are converts, and they decide to go to BYU. And they also struggle with the racial restrictions because they're told that they too can't date other members, including white people.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've answered today. When did BYU begin allowing Black athletes? It was in 1970. Mm-hmm. And why? It was because of a federal civil rights investigation and pressure put on them by other universities as it relates to athletics. That's what led to this change. In this instance, as I'm hearing you, Matt, and reading your book, government pressure and bad media exposure from other institutions constantly protesting against and calling out the church. Is that fair? Did I get that right?
Yeah, one little footnote, and that is they're going to get kicked out of their conference.
Oh, wait. I didn't read that in chapter 5. Does that come later? Is that foreshadowing?
Oh, did I foreshadow my own book?
No, that's good. Or I missed it. It's also
no. They're going to get kicked out of their own They're going to get kicked out of the WAC, and then the protests. I think the short term is they're going to get kicked out of their conference. They'll be without a conference. In the long term,
because by the time I joined BYU in 1987, they're in the WAC. So they must, if they got kicked out, they must have been readmitted.
No. I'm sorry. They didn't get kicked out because they admitted Black people, or Black students, and they started to recruit. But that was the fear. So this is in October in Wilkinson's memo. He told the board, look, they're going to take a vote to kick us out. We're not going to survive the vote. Okay. Even our own fellow Mormon guy, the University of Utah, is going to vote against us.
So they were set to, the WAC was set to vote to kick out BYU.
They were set to boot them.
Yeah.
And that's when they didn't have the vote because the board changed direction and said, okay, well, we can start to allow you, Wilkinson, and your coaches to recruit Black student athletes, but make sure the numbers will be low because we fear interracial marriage.
So do you think they just did a couple, like, do you have the numbers for like 70 to 75? Was it like 2 per foot, for the football team, 2 or 3? Do you know what the numbers even were?
I do. I have a document. I don't have it on me handy. I can maybe bring it for the next episode, but I do have a document in which the athletic coaches go through each of the names that they're recruiting. These are Black athletes in LA and elsewhere. And I think, don't quote me on this, but I think that they said something like, we're going to recruit, 2 or 3 this year and maybe 2 or 3 next year. They were going to sort of stagger it.
Okay.
And a lot of it was just to see how it would happen. This is an experiment.
Yeah.
Right? See if it'll work.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's half of chapter 5 in this incredible book, Second Class Saints, Black Mormons, and the Struggle for Racial Equality by Matt Harris. There's a whole nother part of chapter 8, which we're going to cover next time. Do you want to give us a preview of that, Matt?
Yeah. So next episode, we'll talk about how do the BYU students respond to all of this, because they're bothered by the negative publicity. We've just been talking about the Board of Trustees, but this affects students, including people in my life who I know who were at BYU during this time. So I want to talk about how it affects students. And I want to talk more about that memo that Wilkinson writes to the board. We can read parts of that. And I want to talk about Hugh Brown again, who witnesses the government investigation and witnesses the growing athletic protests. And he's had it. And he leads a private meeting with David O. McKay's sons to get David O. McKay to lift the ban in the fall of 1969 when all of this is going on. And so they decide they're going to lift the ban and ordain a Black man named Monroe Fleming. And we're going to talk about all of that and more on our next episode,
including the Stephen Taggart research paper coming again out of USU, one of my alma maters. Go Aggies.
Yeah, Stephen Taggart, who's overshadowed today as a writer of the church's race teachings, but Stephen Taggart was an early linchpin in a lot of this. And as we'll learn next time, Hugh Brown and a few others will get a hold of this young graduate student named Stephen Taggart. They'll read what he writes, and they'll use it as leverage to convince the president to ordain this Black man to the priesthood. All
right. Yeah. So next episode, I think if we give it a title, it's going to be kind of Hugh B. Brown and his fight to the end and what happens to Hugh B. Brown, because it's kind of a sad story. We don't want to give it away, but it's kind of a sad story what happens to Hugh B. Brown.
Indeed. Yeah, it's tragic.
He gets Uchtdorfed, as we like to say.
Boy, he's probably even more than Uchtdorfed. But
all right. Well, Matt, thank you so much for today. Gerardo had to leave early. Thanks to Gerardo. And Matt, thanks to you for doing the series.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to talk about these important issues, John.
And again, thanks to everyone for supporting this series. Again, the book is Second Class Saints, Black Mormons and the Struggle for Racial Equality. Please buy it now. Buy it for friends. Buy it for family. Let's keep this as one of the top 2 books in Mormonism for at least the next several months, if not more. Also, we've had of the tens of thousands of you who watched this episode, we've had about 50 step up to donate to support this series with Matt. We would love a few of you with means, or several of you with $10 a month, to go to donorbox.org/Matt Harris, donate to this series so that we can, pay Matt what he deserves for the generous time that he's taking away from his own research and family to do these episodes. So please go to donorbox.org/Matt Harris and donate to this series. Thanks to those of you who have. 100% of the money that goes into that link will go to Matt. And we're already committed as the Open Stories Foundation to supporting the rest. So we're matching your donations. Please support us. Also, please know that this podcast is available as a standalone on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and there's a playlist on the Mormon Stories Podcast YouTube channel so that you can binge watch these and share them with others as well. And again, thanks to Julia for all that she does with Timecode show notes and the shorts, and to Maven and Brooklyn and all those at the Open Stories Foundation that make all this possible. And of course, our donors who just donate generally to make all this possible. Couldn't do it without you. Thanks again for everything. We'll see you again soon on another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. Take care and be good to each other and be kind to each other. See you, everybody.